People should appreciate that U.S. Secretary of War Hagel has just returned from Singapore, where, with his deep commitments to nonviolence, he announced that the pivot was not only on, but that we're going to be deploying sea-based laser weapons as a way to counter China's efforts to offset U.S. aircraft carriers and other major weapon systems. I think one way to look at the situation, when I was a junior in college, my professor of international relations said that the study of international relations is analogous to studying the rules of the game among mafia families. As this conference shows, it doesn't have to be that way, but this is the way that it's being practiced. Just to move through some of the current crises, so during the recent Korean crisis, the United States deployed nuclear-capable B-2s and B-52s and conducted simulated nuclear attacks against North Korea. We had the recent crisis over the Senkaku Diaoyu Islands, where at the height of the crisis, both the White House and U.S. Congress said that if it came to war between Japan and China, that we're treaty-bound to come in on Japan's side. Oops. And here, following on what Walden was saying, the Chinese Navy is a way to reinforce its claims to what it calls the South China Seas, recently sent its Navy all the way to Malaysian waters to deliver the proper intimidation. To understand the current moment, I live not too far from Harvard, and so I wander down there from time to time, and repeatedly have heard Joseph Nye, former number 3 in the Pentagon and one of the principal authors of U.S. Asia-Pacific policy for decades now, say that twice during the 20th century, the dominant powers failed to integrate the rising powers, and the result was 2 catastrophic world wars. And his message is that by pursuing both containment and engagement, the United States seeks to integrate China into the global systems that the U.S. dominates as much on U.S. terms as possible. That's the U.S. goal. In any event, the National Intelligence Council, a couple of years ago, looking at global trends, in fact, a publication called Global Trends, said the transfer of global wealth and economic power now underway, roughly from west to east, is, quote, without precedent in modern history and is a primary factor in the decline of the United States' relative strength, even in the military realm. And if you get today's New York Times, in the Sunday Review section, you'll read that the combination of a strong rising China and economic stagnation in Europe and America is making the West increasingly uncomfortable. On talks about Chinese companies moving to buy major food suppliers in the United States and now even Club Med. Europeans and Americans tend to fret over Beijing's assertiveness in the South China Sea, its territorial disputes with Japan, and cyber attacks on Western firms. But all of this is much less important than the phenomenon that is less visible but more disturbing, the aggressive worldwide push of Chinese state capitalism. Front page of the Times today. I'm going to move really quickly through some history. There's not enough time, but just to appreciate that John Kerry is actually a Forbes. The Forbes family developed part of its wealth through the opium trade in the early 19th century. And William Seward, hero of the film Lincoln, in the 1850s was saying if the United States was going to replace Britain as the world's dominant power, we had first to control the Pacific and Asia, the southern approach occupied by Spain and other colonial powers. He bought Alaska to get us the northern approach. Subic, I really remember the lecture I had. I went to Georgetown School of Foreign Service, so I got that training. I remember the lecture about the 1890s, the need for coaling stations in order to gain the China market, and hence the conquest of Philippines, Guam. For the Philippines, it was Subic Bay as the coaling station that was looked for. Just as a reference yesterday to the CIA involvement in Japan in 1960, Actually, in order to extend the secretly imposed U.S.-Japan Mutual Security Treaty, the United States the CIA nurtured over time a former Class A war criminal, Kishi, and he was the one who very undemocratically hammered through the extension of the treaty. And then to say that throughout the Cold War and into the post-Cold War period, the United States has prepared and threatened to initiate nuclear war, as you can see, more than a dozen times in order to maintain its hegemony. I don't know if Andy Lichterman is here, but he's doing important work at looking at the continuing dangers of great power nuclear war. We tend to think that that ended with the Cold War, but it didn't, and to appreciate that the United States, China, and the other nuclear powers are all involved in modernization of their arsenals as we meet. We have Hillary's pivot speech or article. Maybe just the point to look at is how it reinforces what Seward said in the 1850s. And I quote, "One of the most important tasks of the next decade will be to lock in substantially increased investment, diplomatic, economic, strategic, and otherwise, in the Asia-Pacific." It's now been termed by Kurt Campbell, just left as the top guy in the National Security Council for Asia-Pacific, Undersecretary of State, no, actually Undersecretary of State for Asia-Pacific, who has said, well, we need to call this rebalancing. But in the rebalancing, the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Dempsey, has said the U.S. military may be obliged to overtly confront China, just as it faced down the Soviet Union. Our National Security Advisor, Thomas Donilon, has laid out the basic foundations of U.S. Asia-Pacific policy under Obama, as has been mentioned before, to strengthen our alliances, to deepen partnerships with emerging powers, which be inclusive of China, also India and Indonesia in the encirclement, building a constructive relationship with China. We have the summit coming up with President Xi and President Obama, basically the mafia dons to see how they can coexist, and then securing, strengthening regional institutions, as Walden was pointing to with APEC, ASEAN, and so on. Some of the regional areas of tension, the South China Sea with the nine-dotted line, six competing claimants. Important for us to begin to learn about is the inner island chain, which I think China wants to be able to keep the United States from being able to enter it seriously militarily, basically primarily with a concern over Taiwan, but also in relationship to the Diaoyu Senkaku Islands. And we have the unhappy statement of someone from the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences promoted in People's Daily, saying that actually China should be sovereign over Okinawa. And we have, as was focused on last night, the Korean Peninsula, the continuing tensions and dangers there. Okay, so let me give a little bit of background on China's military buildup. Following Hillary's declaration in 2010 that maintaining U.S. preeminence in the South China Sea was a quote-unquote U.S. national interest, Global Times, an official publication from China, said, the U.S.-China wrestling match over the South China Sea has raised the stakes in deciding who the real future ruler of the planet will be. There's an interesting analysis by Alfred McCoy. He's a historian at Wisconsin. You really want to follow what he writes. He said, among other things, that the Pentagon now, quoting the Pentagon now holds the capability to attack, Beijing now holds the capability to attack U.S. aircraft carriers in the Western Pacific, target nuclear forces throughout the continental United States. By developing offensive nuclear, space, and cyber warfare capabilities, China seems determined to vie for dominance in what the Pentagon calls the information spectrum and dimensions of modern battle space. And to appreciate the centrality in this period of history, as it has been from 1898, to have the dominant position in terms of intelligence and surveillance. The U.S. in turn has a new doctrine, air-sea battle. It's developing a whole range of new weapons, modernizing its nuclear arsenal, looking to replace our Trident subs. The F-35, the most expensive weapon system in the world, $1.5 trillion, new fighter bomber to come on the line. The U.S. developing now offensive cyber warfare capabilities, if it didn't already. Space modernization, militarization, as Bruce was talking about last night, and a whole new set of drones. From the Chinese perspective, the United States is building a Great Wall in reverse, moving 60% of its naval forces to Asia Pacific, moving with a whole set of alliance structures that Walden made reference to, keeping Japan as the keystone, even as there are tensions within the alliance. Key elements in the Armitage Nye report came out last August, basically saying that Japan faces a choice whether it's going to remain a first-tier nation or not. When Abe got to Washington, the first thing he said was, we're going to remain a first-tier nation. Pressing Japan not to revise Article 9, which would offend so much of East Asia, but simply to reinterpret it in order to do the same thing, as Professor Kimijima was saying last night. Defining the alliance as a nuclear power and resource alliance, deepening Japanese dependence on American natural gas, among other things. The expansion of Japan's defense guidelines, both the alliance with Japan and Korea are now seen as global alliances for the United States. And the U.S. has been blunted by the excesses in Japan in its effort to build a U.S.-Japan-South Korean alliance. With Korea, very, very important U.S. ally in Northeast Asia. We have a recent, maybe 2 years ago, 3 years ago, during the crisis over the artillery in the West Sea, the Chinese said, look, when you have your responsive military exercises, don't send the nuclear-capable George Washington into the LOC. Well, that's precisely what the United States did, and as the first U.S. ambassador to mainland China, Roy said, we poked China in the eye because we could. India, among others, the United States has a developing and tacit alliance, although India doesn't want to get entirely into bed with the United States. And one dimension of the Trans-Pacific Partnership that was not explored yesterday, it's seen in Washington as a strategic treaty, designed not only for locking in the corporate interests, but more deeply integrating Japan, Korea, many of the nations, of course, not including China, into U.S. culture, U.S. society, and to more isolate them from China at a multi-level kind of struggle. In conclusion, just to say that the way forwards, I think, is to begin thinking in terms of common security, to look at how we can renew the six-party talks, the absolute need for direct U.S.-North Korean negotiations, advocated even by former Ambassador Gregg, and the negotiation of a Northeast Asian nuclear weapons-free zone. In terms of popular movements, obviously, and this has been mentioned many times, the need for solidarity actions with Jeju Island, Okinawa, the whole range there. And I think within the United States, bringing the realities of Asia-Pacific militarization, the struggle with China, into the national budget priorities struggle. This is where the money that should be going to maintain Title VIII housing, food for children, building the infrastructure that we need for our grandchildren to have a decent life. And I think we need to see our strategic allies in this case and make that fight. Thank you.